Hello, listeners, from Roy Demarev in Sam. This week, reporting to you from Izhevsk. Izhevsk, in case you don't know, is the capital of the Republic of Udmurtia, about 1,200 kilometers to the east of Moscow, and famous for its having raised Tchaikovsky, and still continues with a great tradition of music, both sung and played. I'm here to give a lecture, which I have already given, to a group of businessmen who may well come to Geneva in the summer. There were 30 or even 40 in the room where I gave the lecture, mostly belonging to the same group of companies, and they were the victim, if you like, of what I call experiential marketing. I decided that is a topic that I teach in Robert Kennedy College. We have many examples of how companies have typically brought a smile to the face of their potential customers through processes called experiential marketing. And I had heard that this group was rather interested in some further training in Switzerland and contacts indeed with Swiss enterprises. So I thought, well, I'll bite the bullet, I'll go there and give them a taste and experience of my own teaching, and I chose the topic of marketing, which is something I do teach at Robert Kennedy College, and I spoke to them for the best part of an hour, and then we had a discussion in which they asked particularly about how I could establish contacts for them with various companies in Europe in general, but in Switzerland in particular. So I think it went well. And I guess in a future broadcast, I'll tell you whether it went so well that it actually worked, that they did come. They did ask me, in fairness, they did ask me if I could handle a group of 30 or so of their people, all of whom are relatively young. They're not students, they are professionals, and they want more training, yes, but they also want contacts, and that's what I have to demonstrate that I can do. Fortunately, I did this for Russian enterprises in the 90s, so I have some experience with the idea. Now, the thing that's been preoccupying me for these last 5 weeks, as any of you have heard me in these last 5 weeks will recognize, is the contribution to a book being prepared by Alan Bonner in Toronto, in which I provide with him and Natasha from Ekaterinburg some texts on the question of greening a city. And you've heard about my greening of the city project in Ekaterinburg, and what I've done with Radio 74 is summarize some of the texts that I've sent Alan, and he's doing two things with them. One is he's actually had them spread round newspapers and magazines, syndication they call that, and they have gone into a book that he is preparing, which covers many other aspects of cities, not just the environment and greening. He's covering, for example, evacuation plans, where he did a whole load of original research on the appropriateness of escape plans from cities when they are flooded or they have an earthquake or a fire or whatever. I may have more to share with you about the content of that book, but that won't be for today. What is for today is explaining some of the processes that we go through to put together the book. Obviously, there has to be a publisher and an editor, and Alan is doing a grand job of that in Toronto, and he has a colleague whose name I'll bring up next week, who is also supplying many chapters and looking after the overall look of the book. Now, one of the things you need in a book like that are photographs. You need photographs of the contributors, and also in the case of the chapters I've been involved with, we need photographs of Ekaterinburg, both to show its greenness, like photographs of parks and things, but also a skyline of it. That's proven a little bit difficult because we can get photographs okay, but they were never of a sufficient resolution. In the end, Alan told me, look, I can get access to high-resolution pictures. It'll cost a bit, but it's better to do that than, frankly, muck around with me getting photographs which look good to me, but which don't have the resolution his editors and publishers demand. Then he wants some photographs of the writers, the authors, including me. And again, he's demanding high resolution. Now, high resolution is not something you can just do yourself. You can't just take your iPhone or whatever and snap a shot. That isn't the game at all. We're talking here about professional work, and that involves lots of lighting, having you stand in different stances, different backgrounds, black and then colorless, and oh boy, it's so complicated. And I've just been through that. In fact, I am, as I speak, just back from a photographic studio here in Izhevsk. It turns out the studio is open to any artiste, I guess we can call them artiste photographers, who want to hire it and use it and its facilities for their customers. And I was his customer. And my friend Dima, who arranged all this for me, drove me to the suburbs of Izhevsk to this studio where Maxim was the photographer. And he had with him a young man who was, he called him administrator, the guy who actually looks after the studio. That was the first time I've been to a professional studio. Of course, I've had photos taken for passports, but that's a very different game. You sit there, they take 3 or 4 shots, choose the best, and Bob's your uncle. Now, in this case, the overall shooting scene took over an hour. And I had my photograph taken left shoulder forward, right shoulder forward. That was better, by the way, in my case. Full face, full body, just the head, backgrounds in black, backgrounds in white. Then the strange idea of putting 2 black side walls and pushing you in between the 2 of them for a photograph. And this went on and on and on. One of his common expressions, nearly finished, and it never was really finished until a good hour had gone by in the studio, and then we had to wait the best part of another hour while they took all the photographs, and there were well over 100 of them, and put them all onto a flash memory, which I brought with me, and which I will look at in more detail after making this recording. So those have been my main activities in Izhevsk until now. Activities to do with being here, like the lectures I gave on marketing and these photographs, although I must admit I'm spending most of my time marking Robert Kennedy College papers. That's a major load on my shoulders at the moment. I've read in the press, of course, many things about the United States, and again we can express our sorrow at the new massacre in Florida. But we Europeans, we just do not understand when we hear the arguments between the proponents of the free access to guns and those who are against. We're just flummoxed. We cannot understand the argument. It's so obvious to us that guns should not be freely available. And then the other bit of news that caught my eye this week was the death at 99 years of age of Billy Graham. Now, those of us who are quite long in the tooth will remember his crusade, particularly in the UK, in Wembley, I think it was. And I remember that whole process. I think I saw some of his crusades on the television, but one I particularly attended was a colleague of his, and it marked me quite substantially. Not in terms of actually religious faith, because I have that anyway and didn't need his version of it. But I was terribly impressed by this fellow who wanted to demonstrate what faith was and reckoned that he could stand on a very high voltage kind of coil which would send alternating current through his body, and it would lead to sparks coming out of his fingertips if he just stood there and had the faith that it would work. And he did that, and we saw him do that. It was all very impressive. He did put things over his fingers so his fingers didn't get burnt by the flash going out. So maybe that was experiential marketing, to come back to what I said at the very beginning of this talk. That is an experience that I will never forget. Whether it actually improved my Christian faith or not is more debatable. As for the markets, well, it's all rather strange, of course. We've seen these massive falls over the last 5 weeks that I've not been talking about the markets. It's steadied down a bit now. The dollar has fallen a lot, and the basic reason for that is that the new budget in America is extremely deficit, and you can't have a deficit budget without some impact on the value of the currency. It tends to go down. And then the other impact it has is to raise interest rates. It's because the increased activity measured by the GDP in an economy, it can go up, and it is going up in the USA. We would question, some of us, whether it is a sensible growth because it's based on low interest rates and letting people have their tax back and running a huge deficit. Now, all those point to the weaker dollar and a higher interest rate because the inflation is rising and the central bank doesn't like that, so they increase interest rates to try and slow it. And then when you increase interest rates, the companies can't borrow so cheaply, nor can householders, and so you tend to produce less profit, and the stock market becomes vulnerable. But only vulnerable. I can't say it's a big fall yet. That can still happen. I think it will happen, but I've been careful now because I've said so many times it will happen. It simply hasn't happened. I have read somewhere that the increase in interest rates are okay as long as the 10-year rate remains under 5%. I'm a bit skeptical about that observation because for the moment it's anybody's guess as to whether or not this rising interest rate will at one stage trigger a big drop in the stock market. I'll speak to you about that and other things next week.